Terrific. Folks, welcome. Welcome for joining us. I'm Mindy Luber, CEO of Ceres and the Investor Network on Climate Risk. And thank you for taking the time to be here with us today on behalf of both Ceres and the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. While we're delighted to have a global audience joining us today and well over 500 or 600, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Juneteenth federal holiday here in the United States. Yesterday and today, formerly yesterday, but today commemorated by the federal government, is the anniversary of an important day in US history. On June 19th, 1865, African Americans who were wrongfully enslaved in Texas became aware of their freedom, more than 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln declared on January 1st, 1863. As we go about our days today, following this, I want to encourage all of us to educate ourselves further on the holiday, partake in the festivities, and keep its significance in our minds and our hearts as we move forward to discuss a just transition. As I look around this Zoom room and I see friends and family we've worked with for a decade, I'm delighted to see the diversity, the background, the investors, corporate leaders, union leaders, and NGOs with a shared goal of ensuring that economy-wide decarbonization is in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and is indeed brought out in a just transition, accounting for impacts on workers, on our communities, and on our supply chains. Ceres is dedicated to doing just that. It is crucial that we incorporate just transition and equity into all of our work with investors, with companies, our partnerships, our initiatives, and our campaigns. Our investor network includes pension funds that are financed with workers' deferred wages, unions who have bargained for good working conditions and benefits for their members, and asset managers who have made net zero commitments and who seek to transition their portfolios to meet their interim decarbonization targets with justice, inclusion, and equity for workers, for their pensioners, and for their communities. Ceres is a founding partner of Climate Action 100+, an initiative brought to us with CalPERS, and CalPERS obviously, who you will hear more from, as well as Ann Simpson, who is no longer at CalPERS, but will speak to this as well. An initiative representing 700 investors and over $68 trillion in assets under management, working to ensure that the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters take necessary action on climate change. And through this work, we recognize that the just transition must be a key component of the net zero transition, and corporate climate transition plans and investor transition plans must address it. And as such, the Climate Action 100+ integrated a just transition indicator into our benchmark disclosure framework for the first time in 2022. We'll explore this tool in detail today, and I encourage investors to use the indicator and ensure that just transitions are central to every Climate 100+ engagement. And now I'd love to thank the team at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism for joining Ceres as a co-host. And I'll turn the mic over to my colleague, my friend, and the formidable Lynn Forester de Rothschild, founding and managing partner of Inclusive Capital Partners. Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mindy. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone around the world. And thank you so much for joining us. And as Mindy said, Juneteenth really is the right day for us to be discussing this because we are ultimately talking about justice. And Juneteenth is a day to remember the need for justice. So I'm very glad we're together today. And I've got to say that to be doing this with Mindy and the entire staff of Ceres and Climate Action 100 as a co-host to the Council for Inclusive Capitalism makes me feel a little bit since we just had the NBA finals, like I'm on the basketball court with LeBron James, Steph Curry, and Michael Jordan, because really, along with Mark Carney, who we're going to hear from shortly, you are the people who have moved the climate agenda forward more than anyone else. So really, it's an honor to be doing this with you and all the work that we've been able to do together with you. So we promised to everyone that this would be 1 hour. And as you know, we have incredible people speaking, but just little framing, they're going to tell you what the framework for a just energy transition is, why it's important, and how you can incorporate it into your work. Because we know it is urgent that we address climate change, but a sweeping transition to clean energy risks growing inequality. It risks loss of jobs, loss of investments, and high prices for consumers. So we need climate action that is anchored in concerns for the need of effective people and communities. We need a just transition. And as a bit of context for how the Council for Inclusive Capitalism ended up starting this work, I will tell you that it was conceived when we had a council meeting at the Vatican, where Cardinal Peter Turkson said to us that we needed to listen to the words of Pope Francis in the Laudato Si, where he told us to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So that's what motivated this work. And I'm incredibly thankful to the Vatican for inspiring this work, but also to the moral and faith leaders around the world who are working on this with us, and particularly grateful to the Church of England that is adopting the framework in their engagement with companies on the energy transition. And most of all, I'm grateful today to be able to introduce my friend, the incredible Secretary of Energy for President Biden, Jennifer Granholm. She has an illustrious career that has always focused on justice. And so it's no surprise that as the chief energy policymaker for the United States of America, she is also focusing on justice. And with that, I would like to turn the mic over to you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for all the work you're doing. I mean, I'm so happy that this group, this mighty group, is focused on justice, on just transition. Hello, everybody. Privileged to speak to you all because you're all already leading on climate action. And I know that boardrooms around the world feel the presence of climate action 100 plus and are responding to the moves that you're making with that more than $68 trillion of assets. That is a mighty sword you have. So I am here to ask you to think deeply about how to wield that power in the face of our desire to see just transition and in the face of two global crises. So the first one that brought you together, of course, is climate change. And we can see its impacts obviously increasing every year with these intensifying hurricanes and wildfires and heat waves and floods and getting more expensive. And as you know, these intensifying events disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities who do not have the infrastructure to withstand the increasing onslaught of these events. And just to put a number on the price of this and how it is intensifying as well, these extreme weather events last year cost us $148 billion in damages. But if you go back a couple decades, in the 1980s, for example, it cost us about 18 billion. So 148, it's exponentially increasing. And of course, those damages affect disproportionately the communities that Lynn has just been so eloquently describing. Of course, the second crisis only emerged a few months ago, which is Putin's unforgivable invasion of Ukraine, which has roiled global energy markets and has fueled inflation and has shown us just how vulnerable the free world remains as long as we run on fossil fuels. The national security, the energy security implications of Putin's war cannot be overstated. The geopolitical realignments that are happening as a result are momentous. So it is a really turbulent time for all of us, but we have to stay focused because these crises have a common solution, of course, which is clean energy, and the opportunity for communities that have been left behind is astonishing. So we all know that clean energy is cheap and it's abundant and it's reliable and it's going to boost our global energy security. And, I just want to focus on this energy security thing because for 1 second, because no country has ever been held hostage to access to the wind. No access to the wind or the sun has never been weaponized against a country. So if you're already investing big in clean energy, I'm urging you to go bigger, go faster, and be intentional about the investments that you are making. And the global market for clean energy technologies is going to surpass $23 trillion by the end of this decade. And investing to minimize climate risk while smoothing the energy transition is just good business. Because to build an effective clean energy economy, we have to lift up workers and communities with it. Is why President Biden, his entire administration, we are laser focused on creating good quality clean energy jobs with a free and fair chance to join a union, including fossil fuel workers and those who've historically been left behind, left out of economic growth. We call this Justice 40. 40% of the benefits of our investments must go to communities who are at risk. And a big part of our strategy is to make sure we're using existing skills and facilities and infrastructure wherever possible. And I know we can do this. When I was governor of Michigan, I was governor during the crash of the auto industry, the bankruptcies, and we had to strategically invest to embrace Car 2.0, the electric vehicle, which helped our state to rebound, and most importantly, our workers to be able to rebound after that huge economic downturn. So as Secretary of Energy, I'm seeing these similar stories unfold across the country, from Wyoming, where DOE's joined forces with TerraPower, which is a nuclear engineering company, to build an advanced nuclear reactor on top of a decommissioned coal site that'll employ former coal workers. And West Virginia, where local workers are producing steel for the country's first Jones Act qualified offshore wind turbine installation vessel, and so much more. So I am heartened that so many of you are already examining how your investments might impact communities and businesses. Thrilled to know that you're thinking about how you can help to retrain workers for clean energy industries. I want to encourage you to go further, to invest in emerging industries like hydrogen and nuclear, critical minerals that will create opportunities for displaced workers, geothermal, and then to go a step further still by partnering with communities and empowering them to build their own clean energy future. Whenever our world encounters moments of immense challenge, our people and the public and private sector working together, they overcome it and create something better on the other side. And sometimes when you're in the middle of an historic moment, it's hard to see it. But these crises have presented an historic moment. You hold some powerful tools to shape the arc of that history. And I'm confident that by working together to deploy clean energy that will not just make our planet safer and healthier, that you'll all reap some great rewards while we're at it. So let's get going. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Secretary, so much for those really important words. And I think all of us should keep in mind what the Secretary said, that this is an historic moment, that what is happening in the world today can be affected by what each of us do in whatever seat we have. And that is why we created the framework. The framework for a just energy transition is meant to be simply that, a framework that companies and investors can use to accelerate and to scale the just energy transition that the Secretary just spoke so inspirationally about. And when we did it, we partnered in its development with Climate Action 100 Plus and the World Benchmarking Alliance so that we were sure it was a useful, that's an important word, a useful tool as investors engage with companies. So in just a moment, we're going to hear from Marcie Frost, as you know, the CEO of CalPERS, who was one of our key partners in developing the framework. And then we will also hear from Bernard Looney, the CEO of BP, Mark Cutifani, the CEO of Anglo American, Sharan Burrows, the Secretary General of the ITUC, Mark Carney, Special Envoy to the UN on climate action and finance, and of course, your very own Ann Simpson, now with Franklin Templeton. But before we move on, I want to thank the many CEOs who put in time over months to help us get this framework in front of you. And that would be special thanks to Rich Lesser of BCG, Ron O'Hanley of State Street, Eric Francia of ASEAN, Jaime Augusto Zobel de Laya of the Alaya Corporation, Claudia Descalzi of Eni, Mukesh Ambani of Reliance, Josu John Imaz of Repsol, Alistair Phillips Davies, the CEO of SSE, and Nick Robbins from the London School of Economics Grantham Institute. There was an amazing amount of work done with the great staff at the Council for Inclusive Capitalism and at Ceres to present what you are hearing about today. And all the people I listed not only helped develop the framework, but they're leading the way with their actions because they are publicly committing to action on the Council for Inclusive Capitalism website, which I hope all of you will explore. And in fact, the most important reason that we're here today is because we want each of you to join us on this journey and engage with the framework and make public on our website your own commitments to a just energy transition, which you are now going to hear about from the experts, starting with Marcie, who will share CalPERS' commitment to a just energy transition and how CalPERS is leading the way and making the just energy transition framework part of your engagement. So Marcie, I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. So good seeing you again. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, afternoon, or evening, whatever that might be for all of you, with Secretary Granholm and really the rest of the community. And it has really been quite a forceful community of late in my perspective. So for CalPERS, we're a very long-term investor that pays benefits over decades to come for about 2 million members of our system. Every investment decision that is made is being made around sustainability and is being made around resiliency. And of course, we need those risk-adjusted returns that are necessary to pay 2/3 of a member's lifetime benefit. Climate change is something that CalPERS has identified several years ago as one of the top risks to the portfolio itself. And we have to manage that risk across all of our asset classes, whether that's public companies, whether those are private companies, whether those are real assets or real estate. As investors, we of course want our companies to innovate. We want companies to see any changing dynamics that may be happening in their own supply chains. And we also want them to make thoughtful capital expenditures and allocations to ensure they are on a path to provide us with those sustainable long-term returns. We've used our shareholder voice during proxy for proposals related to independent boards or expert board members on climate, transparency and engagement. And we've interacted with the regulatory environment, including the recent SEC proposal regarding disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions in a company's financial statements. And our 27-page response can be found on our website if anyone is interested. To achieve our commitment, the commitment that CalPERS made to being net zero by 2050, and I'd like to add in parentheses or sooner, we need specific strategies to achieve those goals. It will require standardized reporting, data reporting for the companies where we're invested. It requires the boards of companies to be open-minded and diverse, to be thinking about their business models to help them transition to a net zero economy. And additionally, during our corporate engagements, we will be using the new Just Transition or Energy Transition framework during those engagements to ask questions such as, do you have a plan in place to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions? Do you have the supply chains to source the materials that you'll need for the transition? And are you preparing your consumer markets to adapt to their products? The consumer it's an area that I've been spending a lot of time with more recently, that consumer behavior driving the appropriate demand in the markets and appropriate demand in those supply chains. And all of these factors are significant to an investor like CalPERS, who is looking for that long-term investment value. It also requires a regulatory environment that will support an investor's ability to understand how the people and companies across the distribution chain will be affected. We need standardized data on that as well. CalPERS is not alone in this. Investors across the globe are calling for the same information. That's where our partnerships with the Vatican Council for Inclusive Capitalism, Climate Action 100+, Ceres, and the Principles for Responsible Investment come into play. The Council's transition framework provides a pathway to reach net zero by 2050, as well as a platform to advocate as one voice in this community with companies in both the public and private sectors. An example in the private sector is a project that we launched with Carlyle, the Data Convergence Project, which has a nice blend of disclosures and transparency around greenhouse gas emissions, but also has disclosure around human capital metrics. Those two forms of capital have been in our investment beliefs for over a decade. In March this year, Climate Action 100+ released a beta version of the Just Transition Indicator that accounts for the impact on workers and communities affected by a shift to a lower carbon economy. It will add 4 new components to company assessments, including our own engagement with those companies. The assessment criteria will include an acknowledgement, a formal statement that recognizes the social impact of their climate change strategy as a relevant issue for its business, commitment, a publication of policies committed to the Just Transition Plan principles and focused on their workforce to either retain or retrain or redeploy and compensate. Engagement is one of our 4 pillars here at CalPERS. Engagement is a strategy that we use to help with the transition to the lower carbon economy. So how are they engaging with the stakeholders that operate around their own companies? And then action. We absolutely need action. Commitment is one thing, action is quite another. Action aimed at the communities affected by decarbonization. That includes supporting low carbon initiatives, consulting affected communities about decarbonization projects, and financial support of customers and communities that can be adversely impacted by a company's decarbonization strategy. So why is the new indicator needed? I think we all probably know the answer to that, but in short, it really is to demonstrate the work that needs to be done to fulfill the workforce and community needs in the transition, and that can't be done without a reliable data set. So far, we know that only 27% of Climate Action 100+ focused companies have met 1 or more of the indicator's criteria. Of that 27%, 3/4 have taken steps to publicly acknowledge their commitments. That transparency, again, extremely important to the overall plan. And then the remaining focus companies are more advanced in disclosure and will help serve as a model of business practices that can help coalesce others. I'll end my remarks by emphasizing the importance of us continuing to work together. The business community, investors across the globe, governments, regulators, labor unions representing energy sector workers, and consumers. So here now to present the labor perspective is Sharan Burrows. She is the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation for our next segment titled Advancing the S and the E, the Imperative of a Transition with the Social Element.
Well, thank you, Marcie, and indeed Mindy and Lynn particularly, but everybody here, because there is no doubt that this is our chance to make sure that investment does cover the continuum of ESG and not simply the bits that people find easier to implement. There's an absolute need for the standard, Marcie, you are right, and we'll be more than happy to work with you. But we don't have a choice. The way Labor sees it is very simple. There are no jobs on a dead planet. We know that we're running out of time, that we need to scale up the transition. The speed with which the Secretary indicated that we need to shift to renewable energy is all that and more. So I would simply say to you that if we're not putting people and the planet at the heart of public policy, and particularly a just energy policy right now, then we will fail the test for people, but we'll also fail the test for stabilizing the planet. So just transition is a way of simply saying we're not going to leave anybody behind. We've seen too many crises that have left communities devastated, workplaces bereft of sustainable futures, and therefore workers stranded. So we can't have stranded assets, but we can't have stranded people or communities either. Just transition at its heart is very simple. You just need to make sure that workers and their unions are at the table. And I know in the US that since the Biden administration has taken over, there is an energy policy where workers are at the table. Last week at the AFL convention, I not only listened to the president and his commitment to this area, but I actually also celebrated with Liz Schuler and other members the agreement that has been signed now with Ørsted for good union jobs in offshore wind off the coast of New York and indeed further down into Virginia. So we know it's possible. It's also terrific that our pension funds, this time from Denmark, kick-started that work, and we want to see more of this. So having unions at the table, where there's a confidence about what a negotiated plan is, where it's transparent, then people know that there will be jobs and security for themselves and their children. Where, of course, older workers are displaced, we need secure pensions. It's the least of the cost of transition, and yet often people don't make sure that that's guaranteed. We need to make sure for younger workers that there is income support and reskilling support and redeployment support as you are transparent about where the new jobs are coming from. We're not frightened about jobs. The job story is actually a really positive one in most areas. Certainly for renewable energy, for every 10 jobs in renewable energy, if there are good jobs, there's 5 to 10 in the manufacturing supply chain. And again, if it's decent work, there's 30 to 35 in the broader community. I did this work with the World Resources Institute on this area and many other sectors. We need to stop the myth that there will be jobs lost. There will be jobs often transferred, and that's the plan for a labour force protection that we need. My biggest frustration of the moment, if we're going to make the scale of change and to protect workers, is actually the fossil fuel companies. They have the capex, they have the asset base, they have the technology, and they have the skilled workforce, but they're not moving fast enough. I know that some are now invested, and Bernard is with me, in areas of renewable energy and in green hydrogen. I'm happy to see that, because there are more jobs actually in the hydrogen end of the transition for heavy industry than you lose in the process change. But Bernard, we need your help to drive all the companies to high ambition, because we're not getting there fast enough. So what I would say is then that the only other element of transition is that we actually look at what the impact on the community is. And it's not good enough, and I see investors, Mark, you would know this better than anybody, walking away from their coal stocks, walking away from vulnerable stocks, rather than actually taking the responsibility that some companies are indeed doing to say, if we're going to have to shift a coal-fired power station, or we're transferring this piece of production, then where we can't replace production activity or distribution activity on that side, what can we do with the community? What can we do in an agreement with unions and governments? So I'll leave it there, but suffice to say, working together, we can in fact build communities, make sure that those who are indeed vulnerable are invested in, and I'm happy to introduce Mark Carney because, in fact, Mark is known to all of you for his extraordinary career, which has spanned, of course, the Central Bank of Canada and of the UK, but also the Financial Stability Board, where I first met Mark, and the road to the standard setting that is there today. Today, of course, Mark is the UN Envoy, Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. He's been an advisor to the UK government on COP26, but from our perspective, his initiative to drive finance, including workers' capital, pension funds, to be indeed responsible capital over the long term, patient capital, with a just transition lens. And I'm counting on Mark to deliver those transparency plans that give us all confidence that we are indeed making the transition. So thank you, everybody, for this, and Lynn in particular for the leadership of the council, and Mark for your work. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And let me thank Ceres, Climate Action 100 Plus, the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, all of you for your leadership. Sharon, our partnership began over dinner in Basel, a productive and challenging partnership that began there. Something good coming out of Basel. Let me share a few perspectives from the financial institution side, but let me say up front something that's been emphasized in a number of conversations that many of us have had, that a just transition is a moral, market, and practical imperative. The social consensus for dealing with climate change will not and should not hold if the transition is not just. We can't achieve environmental sustainability if we sacrifice our economy and with it people's livelihoods. And similarly, we won't get to the necessary solutions or the speed that we need without market forces. Now, given that a just transition or a net zero transition will affect every sector of our economies and by extension, everybody, just transition must be integral both to company strategies and in the investing process. And let me make three main comments about the financial sector's potential contributions to this, and I'm trying to build on what colleagues have said and not repeat. The first thing, rightly, it's been emphasized, data transparency, comprehensive data, and I just want to signal that 2 weeks ago, the UN, the OECD, the IMF, the French presidency, President Macron, and GFANZ launched the process for a open source global data program for all, and I underscore all, transition-related data from companies and the financial institutions that serve them. And this will allow stakeholders to hold those financial institutions and companies to account, but it will also help policymakers track and anticipate the scale of that transition. And I very much hope that we will be including and expect that we'll be including the new framework for just transition metrics being discussed today. The second point is that last week, building on the great work and leadership of Ceres and Climate Action 100 Plus and others, GFANZ released a draft framework for net zero transition plans. And those are for financial institutions, of companies, of sectoral transition pathways, portfolio alignment, and of managed phase out. And the point of this is to encourage a common global approach to transition. It's open for consultation till the end of June. And within this, I want to signal the importance of both the sectoral transition pathways and what's being called managed phase out of stranded assets. Now, managed phase out of those assets provides two key components of a just transition: time, which is always in short supply in climate change, and clarity about the pathway for an asset or an industry. It helps avoid a climate sudden stop with a rapid and disorderly shutdown. And more positively, it creates space for the retraining of workers and the development of new opportunities for them. And as Sharon and others have emphasized, Secretary Granholm as well, the net zero transition will be net positive for employment as a whole. But as we all know, it will result in significant churn of jobs that require extensive retraining and potentially relocations. And companies can help maximize the probability that those with the jobs of the past can find those of the future. And I'd also like to underscore the work Inclusive Capitalism has done on highlighting the risks of transition of stranded assets into the shadows. As the council says, companies retain the responsibility for workers and communities after divesting, retiring, or selling an asset. Now, engagement is fundamental to the approach. That means official sector engagement, getting countries to provide a systemic approach and supporting policies to improve energy affordability, energy availability, new employment for effective workers, and bolster resilience. But it also means portfolio companies addressing their impacts, and through the 4 pillars that Marcie underscored, acknowledging the social impacts, commitment to just transition principles, engagement with all stakeholders to put those principles into the 4th pillar, which is what we need as action. Now, my final point involves the transition in the emerging and developing world. Many of us have been vocal and active in support for enhanced country platforms to promote these transitions. These so-called JET-P partnerships, or Just Energy Transition Partnerships, these discussions have just begun in South Africa and Indonesia, Vietnam. The point is to create integrated strategies to reduce emissions while retraining workers, widening energy access, improving affordability, and growing economies. And what's essential here is that net zero committed capital, and I'm almost finished, can finance all aspects of the transition, not just pure green energy. So comprehensive approaches for concessional, blended, and private finance accordingly. So to conclude, it is very important that financial institutions integrate just transition into their transition plans, utilizing the Climate Action 100 Plus's Just Transition Indicators, the Inclusive Capitalism Council's Just Energy Transition Framework, and guidance from Net Zero Alliances. And to that last point, I'd encourage input to the current consultation on the GFANZ Common Framework. Now, to further move this forward, it's my honor to introduce Ann Simpson, who, as you heard at the start, is now at Franklin Templeton as Global Head of Sustainability. She's a member of Climate Action 100 Plus's steering group, longtime advocate and leader in this area. And Ann will discuss, amongst others, how this Just Energy Transition Framework maps to the Just Transition Indicator. So Ann, if I can give you the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Mark, and welcome everybody. This could not be a more timely and important discussion that we're having. And Mark, I remember some 5 years ago coming to have tea with you at the Bank of England and setting out this initial data analysis that we'd done at CalPERS, which showed around 100 companies were responsible for about 80% of industrial emissions. And that really set the stage for us putting together Climate Action 100 Plus. So this partnership with the Council of Inclusive Capitalism and the work we're doing also with the World Benchmarking Alliance under the framework of the GFANZ and all the great work you're doing really shows that we're starting to get to work. But I wanted first to reference the Paris Agreement itself, because there is in the wake of the pandemic, an understanding of the importance of taking care of people. We've been reminded of that. It was long overdue. And the war in Ukraine has made us realize that the energy transition is also going to have an impact on food security. In other words, we need to have joined up thinking about sustainable development, and climate action transition is one piece of that. And this therefore means we're not only facing a moral imperative, but it's an economic necessity. The shared prosperity in these economies that need to make the transition provide the investment environment to generate the risk-adjusted returns for fiduciaries like CalPERS as an asset owner, Franklin Templeton, our fiduciary duty to deploy capital to generate those risk-adjusted returns means we need to take care of the financial capital, the human capital and the natural capital, as Marcie was saying. So let me just quote to remind us all, what did the Paris Agreement say? In other words, when 196 governments signed up for the Paris Agreement, the Just Transition was a framing idea in the preamble. And this is what it says. Taking into account the imperative of a just transition of the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally determined contributions. So it's right there, the impact on the workforce, but it goes more broadly, and which is very much the concern with today's discussion. And the preamble continues, acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humanity, all parties, when taking action to address climate change, need to respect and promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, the rights of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, which obviously speaks to the need for affordable access to energy, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. So really what we're doing in this work through Climate Action 100 Plus to integrate the just transition into the benchmark and help build out the framework for the just energy transition with the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, we really are anchored in the original ambition of the Paris Agreement. So how do these two pieces of work fit together? The first thing to say about the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmark is it's intended to give an integrated assessment of the progress that companies are making, not just their financial progress, for example, alignment of CapEx. This is essential. We can't forget that we want companies to thrive and prosper through the transition. They've got tough decisions to make, but the financial returns are central for investors who are fiduciaries. Also, in that benchmark, we have highlighted the importance of the just transition for the first time, as Marcie said. And critical to that is the need for companies to develop a plan in line with the International Labour Organization guidelines for the impact on the workforce. And the purpose of this is to make sure there's been full consultation with the workforce, with the unions where they're recognized, but other ways of making sure there's workforce engagement need to be found otherwise, but also communities and other stakeholders. What the Just Energy Transition framework from the Council for Inclusive Capitalism then provides is the guidance, the practical guidance on how to move ahead on this. And there are 4 pillars, as you know. Access to affordable energy, this is essential. Workforce evolution, as Sharan was just talking about. Community resilience is essential. And then ensuring there is collaboration and transparency right through the process. Now, companies are only just beginning to make a start on this. As Marcie said at the beginning, we've developed 8 metrics to track this progress in the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmark, and just over a quarter of these companies have begun to acknowledge the need. But I'm delighted to say today we are going to have a chance to hear from 2 companies which are really engaging with this topic of the just transition in a very practical way. We're starting to not only help build out this framework, but also report under it. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Bernard Looney and also Mark Cutifani, who just stepped down as CEO of Anglo-American, and Bernard, of course, is Chief Executive of BP, which I should say when we did our first benchmark assessment, Bernard, BP was one of the few companies which had got to almost half its CapEx being aligned with the net 2050 target. So there's obviously been tremendous work underway there. So in that, let me hand over to Bernard to talk us through what BP is doing. And from that, Bernard will hand over to Mark to hear his reflections on where Anglo-American has got to in this work. So thanks.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Anne, and thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you all. And Marcie, thanks for the support you give us at CalPERS, one of our owners, and obviously therefore an influencer in our direction. And looking forward to hearing from Mark Cutifani in a moment. Big admirers of Mark's at BP, uniting. He's done a massive transformation at Anglo-American, uniting profit and purpose, I think. So looking forward to hearing from Mark. I think the has been asked to talk a little bit about the why behind our transition. And, put simply, it's what the world wants. It's what our people want. And importantly, and Secretary Granholm referred to this, it's also a tremendous business opportunity. And that's why after 113 years as an international oil company, we're pivoting to this thing called an integrated energy company. And an IEC's role in life is to help solve the energy trilemma, which is very much clear today, which is how do we provide the world with secure, affordable, and cleaner energy? And at BP, we intend to do it two ways. First, by providing the world with the energy it needs now, today, which is predominantly a hydrocarbon-based energy, but we will do that with lower emissions. And, and at the same time, investing at scale to accelerate the energy transition in bioenergy, in EV charging, in renewables, in hydrogen. Sharan just mentioned hydrogen. We just announced a massive opportunity in Western Australia, up to 26 gigawatts of green hydrogen potentially there. And the need for this energy security for today and then accelerating the transition at the same time, I think has never been clearer than it is right now. And there shouldn't be a choice. There must not be a choice between one or the other. We need to do both. And of course, the challenge is how do we make that transition in a way that no one gets left behind? And for that transition to be successful, it must be just, and however much people want change, no one truly gets behind the change if it hurts them. It's very much human nature. Mark Carney put it more eloquently, I know, but for me, it's as simple as there will not be a transition if it is not just. And that's why we've worked with the council on the framework. And just very quickly, because I know we're running short of time, we're up in Teesside here in the UK. We've got a massive program called Net Zero Teesside. It's a heavily industrialized center of Britain. It represents around half of the UK's big industrial cluster emissions. And I visited Teesside recently and I asked people what it was like to live around there. And they told me they loved it, like we all do in our areas we grew up in. But they were worried about their jobs. And they told me they were worried that their children were going to have to leave to find work. So what are we doing? Well, we're going to help them decarbonize Teesside. We'll capture the emissions, we'll store them underground, we'll build a power station, we'll build hydrogen. And the plan there is that we'll help make these industries lower carbon. And if they're lower carbon, they'll be more competitive. And if they're more competitive, they'll last longer. They'll be more sustainable for the long term. And with that will be people's jobs and livelihoods. And we think we can support about 25,000 good jobs a year out there. It's complex. The framework's been enormously helpful to us. It tells us to go to education. We've got BP people in 22 schools helping kids understand how science is useful in low carbon. The framework says, we should support suppliers. So we built a low carbon business accelerator unit with some of our own experts and so on. So lots to do, loads going on. The framework's been hugely helpful. And that's probably enough from me, and I'll pass off to Mark.
Thanks very much, Bernard. Are you okay if I go, Marcie?
Go ahead, Mark. Why don't you just talk a little bit about why you joined and give us some specific examples of what you're doing?
Okay. Well, firstly, thanks, Bernard. Great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thanks to Lynn and the rest of the team for the great leadership. From our point of view, we started talking transition and targets in terms of carbon reductions back in 2017, when we also framed our purpose for the business to reimagine mining to improve people's lives. We take that seriously, and that has been front and centre in our conversations across the globe. For the mining industry, we produce the metals and minerals that make the transition possible. And when we explain the role of steel, copper, and a whole range of materials, people start to appreciate how important the role of mining is in making sure we can navigate the transition with the materials that we need to get there. From our point of view, it really is a significant task in understanding what a just transition looks like. For us at the moment, we're exiting our thermal coal business. In fact, we've exited our thermal coal business with the demerger. Through that process, we consulted with employees, governments, local communities, a whole range of stakeholders, and we left the business in good shape, net cash position with all of the resources they needed to navigate the completion of the work through the rest of life of the operations. Really important. We could have sold the assets and made a very nice turn in terms of cash, but we demerged, so no revenue, and we left the business with cash, and we bankrolled their potential liabilities if they ran into trouble. So far, the timing's turned out to be very good and they're doing extremely well. And the stakeholders have reported back to us they're very pleased with the commitments and the work that we've done. For us, we're also bringing on new operations, Quellaveco, new copper mine, being commissioned as we speak, a little bit earlier than we anticipated, so that's great news. We're also building a new operation up in Teesside, and Bernard knows the project, Woodsmith, which will be low carbon fertilizers for the world. So our whole portfolio is geared towards a new transition, a new energy transition. Decarbonising our existing operations, absolutely critical. 43% of our global operations are already on renewable energy, all of our South American operations. And in South Africa, we put a proposal where we're looking at wind turbines, solar energy, water-based battery technologies to transfer our existing operations to renewable energy by 2030. And all of these programs we've been doing this type of work in non-OECD countries. So in terms of a just transition, I think it's got extra meaning in those jurisdictions. We have just commissioned, and we're in the process of commissioning, the first 400-ton off-highway truck, which is a hydro battery truck. We asked the OEMs, we want this for 2025. They said, we can't do it under any circumstances. No one could. We've commissioned one now. We built it ourselves. We took 5 partners, Ballard on fuel cells, on batteries. It's a major energy provider, and we've built a truck that they said couldn't be done. So we're taking Bernard and his team on Teesside, looking at how we can make a contribution. So it's all about having the commitment, making a difference. Marcie, I'll hand over to you. I know we're tight on time.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Bernard and Mark. Thank you for your commitments and, more importantly, the actions that you're taking to support those commitments. At this point, I will turn it back over to Mindy to see if we have any questions coming in from the chat.
Thanks, Marcie, and thanks to all of you. Those were quite extraordinary comments. Now our job is to collectively get it done. And I think while we see lots of questions, and I'm trying to aggregate some of them for those who have asked questions, and if we don't get to them in our short 5 or 6 minutes left, we will get back to you one way or another with answers to the questions. But with the imperative of now, of moving as quickly as humanly possible, how do we make sure, maybe, Anne, it's integrated, just transition is integrated into CA100 plus, and to Mark, that the integration is fully within GFANZ, and to our colleagues running companies, the same question. We are all on this journey together. We all know it is now about pace and scale and justice. And we want to make sure as we turbocharge our pace and scale, we are leaving nobody behind. So let me ask that question. It tries to pull together some of the questions I'm seeing. Maybe we'll start with you, Anne. We'll go to Mark, we'll go to Bernard, we'll go to Mark.
No, thanks very much, Mindy. And thank you for that question, which really sums up the challenge, but also the opportunity that we've got here. The most important thing is to have people at the center of climate change planning. We've tended to talk about it as a financial risk, and rightly so. And thank you to Mark for really, through the work he led over some years, understanding this as a financial risk, and therefore it's part of our fiduciary duty to address it. Secondly, we're all very well aware of the science. We're very aware of the physical environment, the physical risks, and also the economics and technology around the transition that we need to grapple with. But we mustn't forget that if people are not at the heart of the transition, I think it's just been said, it will not happen. whether that comes through protests from people unable to pay increased fuel prices. We've seen that in France with the Gilets jaunes a couple of years ago, whether it's in a rich country like the United States, where concern about impact on the transition holds up political consensus on the policy that's needed, or whether it's in poor countries where people don't yet have access to affordable energy. We've got to broaden the scope of our thinking so that we take this holistic approach. If we put people at the center, this will actually anchor us and protect us against some of the risks in managing this whole process. But as Marcie said, it's all about the practical examples. And this is where investors will be using the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmark, not to have the just transition out here as a separate topic, but have it fully integrated into the consideration of emissions reductions plans, board governance and oversight, compensation and incentives, CapEx alignment, very important, but also we are focusing on the need to have integrated reporting and accounting and ensuring that audit picks up this as well. So we have this dream of a common language, and it needs to be holistic to capture all these risks and opportunities. Thanks.
Right. Before I jump to Mark, I want to bring Sharan back in, who has been out there talking, working in every part of our globe on just transition. Sharan, how do we turbocharge our efforts?
So we know that you have to bring workers to the table. Right now, our Just Transition Centre has all of our affiliates in a dialogue around the energy transition. We've been working with the IEA and the International Energy Association to actually scale up. And what we want to do next through the Labour Council of the IEA and the Employment Council, we want to actually have that dialogue, bringing the concerns of workers, not just to their specific companies, which of course we do, but as a dialogue where we can actually move forward. So it really is about dialogue. It's about involving people, and the scale is only possible where we put the time and energy into making sure that all stakeholders, as Lynn said in opening, are actually there to enable their voices to be heard and transparent agreements to be struck.
Great. Sharan, thanks. And Mark, with our collaborative effort around GFANZ, how do we make sure this is front and center?
Yeah, I think it is. The answer is in your question, Mindy, because as you know, it's a collaborative effort, and I think the great work that you've done and those on this call and by extension have done sets up this well for the Just Transition framework to be integral to transition plans of companies and financial institutions. And I'll just make one point to emphasize on this. I think the collective effort, though, has to recognize that this responsibility of a financial institution, of a company, for an asset, for a project of that is high emitting and is being transitioned out, that responsibility lives with the asset. And it may be in the best interest, in fact, in many cases, it will be in the best interest of the workers, of the transition, of the community, for those institutions to retain the asset, because they are, after all, the responsible owners of the assets. And we really, the thing that worries me the most is the ease with which assets can be divested, pushed into the shadows, problem wiped away. And of course, the problem only gets worse under irresponsible ownership. And so I think by bringing the framework into the heart of transition planning, we can avoid that and have much better outcomes. And I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you, Mark. Bernard, we are on a timetable that's got to be turbocharged. Well, help us think about that.
Just a couple of things, Mindy, from my perspective. One is, we have to put our money where our mouth is. Talk is fine, as my mother would say, talk is cheap. But we have to put our money where our mouth is. In 2019, 3% of BP's capital went into non-oil and gas. Last year, that was close to 20%. In 3 years' time, 2025, it'll be over 40%. In 2030, it'll be over 50%. So we have to deploy capital consistent with making the transition happen. And that's what we're doing, and we're being absolutely aggressive as we can. And the second thing I would say is we have to be conscious, as Sharan said, of workers, of communities as we go through this, because when you're conscious of it, sometimes the problem isn't quite as complex as what it might first seem. You know, we've been in oil and gas in Aberdeen for 50 years. I started my career there. We're going to put our global offshore wind center in Aberdeen. So the people that worked in our oil and gas facilities will transition over into that global offshore wind center. Why wouldn't we do that? They're clever people. They've got great experience. We can give them a bit of retraining and transition them to a new economy. So one is we have to act. We have to put our money where our mouth is, and we are. And secondly, there is just a thing about being conscious of this, and that's what the framework does. Is it puts it on the table, so to speak. So when we're making choices, we remember these things, and suddenly you'll find that there are fantastic opportunities to help.
Well, Mark, a quick word, our second Mark, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to close us out and get us on our way today.
Thanks, Marcie. We've got 5 things. Firstly, reducing our energy consumption by 30% by 2030 is a competitive imperative. We're a better company because of what we're doing. So that's key. Lower cost technologies. Mining's been done the same way for 200 years. We've just got bigger. We're thinking of smarter ways, more precise mining, reducing energy. Collaborative workplaces, making sure everybody's involved in the change in the workplace, absolutely key. And they take those conversations into the community. And with our new truck concepts and new hydrogen systems, we're able to include the local communities in hydrogen energy. And in many of the emerging economies of the world, they don't have access to energy. So we're solving a number of issues, and we're part of the community solution in providing them energy efficient and clean energy. So making sure you're part of all of those issues and making partners of our industry colleagues in the change allows us to scale up and go beyond just us as a company.
Great. Well, you've all given me some more hope that we could get there, as we must do for our kids and our future, and do so in a fair way. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague and friend Lynn to close us out.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I'm sure I speak for everyone in the audience that this could go on for hours, and we would continue to learn and be inspired by all of the speakers. And just so you all know, everyone who spoke today has invested hundreds of hours in getting this right and in thinking about that just energy transition. Because as Bernard said, we won't have an energy transition if it is not just. So from wherever you sit, I ask you to think about your climate interests in light of the needs of our communities, our consumers, our workers, and our planet. Or as Pope Francis said, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Thank you so much for everything that you do. I hope you will continue to engage with us. I am going to be bold and give you the email address of Meredith@inclusivecapitalism.com, our CEO. She will answer your questions. And I just, God bless all of you. Keep up the good work, and thank you for everything.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. And feel free to call on us at Ceres. We are here to help. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Lynn.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bernard.